video, I'm going to wrap up the books that I read in the second half of March. But first of all, I'm going to give the monthly statistics. In the month of March, I read a total number of 15 books. Among those 15 books, 4 of them can be considered as fantasy. 4 of them were adventure / general fiction books. I read 2 books in the genres of mystery, non-fiction and historical fiction. And I read 1 science fiction book. The total number of the pages of those 15 books amounted to 3,573 pages. I read 2 books that has less than 100 pages, 2 books between 100 and 200 pages, 8 books between 200 and 300 pages, 2 books between 300 and 400 pages, and 1 book between 500 and 600 pages. The average number per book amounted to 238.2 pages per book. As for the publishing date, I had even a wider variety of years for the books this month. I read 1 book that was written in 1800, 1 book that was written between the years of 1900 and 1910, 1 book written in 1910s, 2 books written in 1930s, 1 book written in 1940s, 1 book written in 1960s, 1 book written in 1990s, 3 books written between the years of 2000 and 2010, 3 books written between the years of 2011 and 2015, and 1 book written between the years of 2015 and 2019. Among those 15 books, 6 of them can be considered classics, and 9 books were neither classics or modern classics. As for the original language of the books, the 11 books were originally written in English, 2 books were originally written in Turkish, and 1 book each was originally written in Italian and in French. I read 12 novels, 1 novella, 1 picture book, and 1 graphic novel. I read 8 adult books, 6 middle grade books, considering I joined the middle grade March. This statistic made sense, of course, and 1 young adult book. And I read 8 e-books, 4 paperbacks, and 3 audiobooks. As for my rating, I had much higher ratings this month than the previous 2 months. I only gave 1 book 6 out of 10. I gave 6 book 7 out of 10, 6 book 8 out of 10, and 2 books 9 out of 10. And my average rating in March was 7.6 out of 10. I previously did the wrap-up of the 8 books that I read in the first half of March. And this time I'm going to wrap up the 7 books that I read in the second half of March, and 1 short story in a book that I'm currently reading. But I read this short story for March Mystery Madness, so I'm going to mention that short story as well. The first book that I finished in the second half of March was a graphic novel called Torso. It was a true crime non-fiction graphic novel. I read this book for March Mystery Madness for the prompt of reading a book with a 5-word title. Torso was written by Brian Michael Bendis and illustrated by both Brian Michael Bendis and Marc Andreyko. The book takes place in Cleveland, 1935. Eliot Ness was the legendary DA who triumphed over Al Capone in Chicago, is appointed to Cleveland. During his time, dismembered body parts started washing up in a concentrated area of Lake Erie Sound. Headless torsos that left no clues to their identity or reason for death. It tells the story of how Eliot Ness and the police service tried to solve this mystery. It was a very interesting reading experience for me. I really enjoyed the story, the true crime aspect of it. And although I struggled with the drawing style because it did not follow a linear reading order for the panels. Sometimes it was the combination of diagonal panels with horizontal panels, and even it had some very interesting drawing style. Sometimes halazonic panels like this one, as you see in the picture. I think it was brilliant on the illustrator's point of view, because these sort of panels really showed how the characters were feeling their inner thoughts and how chaotic their feelings and thoughts were about this true crime, and how horrific that was. And I have to give a warning, because it's a true crime book. It contains some elements from the real photos, and they sometimes combined it with the panels, and it was a bit hard-hitting if you do not like gore or body horror. I do not mind such things, so it was very interesting for me to read this book. So I gave this graphic novel 8 out of 10. I then finished another book for my Stacking the Series challenge, The Queen's Fool by Phillippa Gregory. This time Phillippa Gregory did not follow the perspective of a real person, but rather a fictional person, Hannah Green. In the beginning of the book, she's a 14-year-old Jewish girl and is forced to flee Spain with her father. But Hannah is no ordinary refugee. Her gift of sight, the ability to foresee the future, is priceless in the troubled times of the Tudor court. Robert Dudley brings her to the court as a holy fool for Queen Mary and ultimately Queen Elizabeth when she was a princess. I also gave this book 8 out of 10. It was a very interesting book. This time we had a very likable protagonist, although she was a bit silly in the beginning of the book. She matured as she saw how cruel the court can be and how people were a bit of hypocrite when it comes to even their loved ones. And it was also very interesting because Hannah really loved Queen Mary, and from the things that I read from the history, I never thought Queen Mary as a sympathetic character. I didn't really like her so much, but I tried to see her point of view because that's what Hannah was doing. It's interesting to see how the two sisters became rivals and then enemies as the time progressed. Although I felt some parts were unnecessarily long, I really enjoyed reading the book. And then I finished the short story in the collection of all the Sherlock Holmes stories. I read this short story for Much Mystery Madness. For the prompt of reading the short story, starts with page number that is divisible 55. Actually, this short story started at page 500 in the book that I'm reading. This short story was titled The Adventure of the Dancing Man. It was one of the 18 stories in this cycle published in The Return of Sherlock Holmes in 1905. It was originally published as a short story in the Strand magazine in 1903. And Sir Arthur Conan Doyle actually ranked this short story as his third favorite short story. The story begins when Hilton Cabot in Norfolk visits Sherlock Holmes and gives him a piece of paper with the following mysterious sequence of stick figures. I can see why Doyle ranked this story as one of his favorites, because it was one of the best stories that I read in the book so far. I gave this short story 9 out of 10. It was very interesting. It had some clues of, as you can see, some visual elements in the short story. And the mystery was really interesting. I'm really glad I read this short story. And it was just a coincidence that this story started in page 500, because I mostly gave Sherlock Holmes stories 7 or 8 out of 10. So this was really a happy coincidence for March Mystery Madness. I then finished A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett in audiobook. I read this for middle grade March, and for the prompt of reading a book that is set in another country. This story takes place in England, and it tells the story of Sarah Crewe, an exceptionally intelligent and imaginative student at Miss Minchin's Select Seminary for Young Ladies, is devastated when her adored, indulgent father dies. She then becomes penniless, and she is banished to a room in the attic, and Sarah is demeaned, abused, and forced to work as a servant in the school when she becomes poor. This was actually a very sweet story. I really enjoyed listening to this book. I previously read The Secret Garden and liked that story much more than this one because there was no character development. With regards to Sarah, she was a bit too good a character for me. She was too good in the beginning of the book, and she was too good in the end of the book. So I had hard time identifying with Sarah actually. But the side characters were very interesting, and how their attitude towards Sarah changed when she became poor, and it was a real powerful message to see who your true friends are, because they would not change when you are poor or when you are in hard times. I can see why it's a classic, but for the reasons that I've mentioned before, I gave this book 7 out of 10. I then finished Son Yelkovan by Dilge Güney. Dilge is one of my dear friends in real life. So I will try to be as objective as I can about her book. I read this book for the prompt of reading a book about books in middle grade March. I could not have chosen a better book than this one. I did not know that it would be so much related to books. It tells the story of a 14-year-old girl, Anka, and she meets a very famous author, Biranda Sarin, and they become very good friends in such a short time. And one day she wakes up and sees that Biranda has disappeared from the world, and nobody remembers her but Anka. Then the story goes on to another magical world. I really enjoyed the fantastical world that is created in this book. If not for the a bit predictable ending, I would have given this book a 9 out of 10, but I still gave it 8 out of 10. And I really enjoyed the reading experience of this book. So I'm going to say what I've said before. I wish that her books were translated into English. So many of the children in the world would read her books, because they are very complex and very beautiful books with so many meaningful messages. I then read an extra book for middle grade March. This was actually the last chance that I gave to the author Jules Verne, a very famous classical author. I said that I was done with Jules Verne after DNFing one book and reading a very boring book by him. But my nephew lent this book, Journey to the Center of the Earth, in Turkish of course, to me, and said, Auntie, if you would like this book, I think you have chosen the worst books by him, so I think you should give him another chance. And I read Journey to the Center of the Earth. The book tells the story of the strangest expedition of the 19th century, a journey down an extinct Icelandic volcano to the Earth's very core. The story is told from the point of view of the professor's nephew, who who leads this expedition. It's a very interesting story, and I really enjoyed reading this. My nephew was right. I did not love the story, but it was interesting. I found the writing style very dry again, but the plot was interesting enough to keep me going, and I was pleasantly surprised by the good ending of this book. So I gave the book 7 out of 10. I then read an Italian book, Sıfır Sayı by Umberto Eco. This was a library book. Actually, it was the last book that I've checked from the library before the libraries were closed in Turkey. This book was not translated to English, so I cannot say the English title, but it can be translated as Number 0. This was the last book written by Umberto Eco, by the way. This book, Colonna, who's around 50, has a job offer from Simei. They are going to do experimental daily newspapers that would not be published, and they would be called Number 0. It was an interesting book. It was actually a guideline to bad journalism in some parts. I think any reader who's more interested in journalism and how the media works would have liked this book much better than me. Additionally, I think if I had known about the history of Italy more, I would have understood some parts which were actually about political intrigue, because I could not understand the significance of some events. This diminished my reading experience. So although it was a really worthy book, I gave the book 7 out of 10. And the last book that I read in the month of March was my favorite book in the second half of the month, Giant's Bread by Mary Westmacott, the pseudonym used by Agatha Christie when writing non-mystery books. Giant's Bread tells the story of Verne there, and he's a genius musician. Verne is loved by 2 women. He loves one of them. The story covers a time period between his childhood and his adult years until about his, I think, like 35. I originally thought this book would be a romance book, but it was much more than a romance book. I loved the writing style, which was not a surprise actually, because I loved the writing style of Agatha Christie and how she can write like modern writers, even though this book was written in 1930. This was not a romance book. It falls in the category of general fiction or literary fiction. Some parts actually have very powerful messages. Even though it contained one of my least favorite tropes, like love triangle, it was not obvious who he really loved, like in many of the romance books that I read and I actually enjoy. That's why I'm saying it was much more than a romance book, because although it contained some tropes and traditional plot devices, the execution of the story was not done in the traditional way. I really enjoyed this book. I could not put it down, and I gave it 9 out of 10. And by the way, I read this book because Lil from Lil's Vintage World is doing a read-along for Mary Westmacott books. I'm really glad that I've joined this read-along, and I cannot wait to read more from Mary Westmacott. So this was the most pleasantly surprising book of the month for sure. Lastly, I want to talk about how I did with the readathons that I participated in. In March, I participated in 2 readathons, Middle Grade March and March Mystery Madness. For Middle Grade March, I read 6 books actually, and for the 5 prompts. For the prompt of reading a book with illustrations, I read The People Could Fly by Virginia Hamilton. For the prompt of reading a mystery book, I read 5 on a Treasure Island by Enid Blyton. For the prompt of reading a book that is set outside your country, I read A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett. For the prompt of reading a book about books, I read Son Yelkovan by Dilge Güney. For the prompt of reading a book with a screen adaptation, I read The Subtle Knife by Phillippa Pullman. And the sixth book that I read for not any of the prompts was Journey to the Center of the World by Jules Verne. And for Much Mystery Madness, I read 5 works for the 5 prompts. For the prompt of reading a book with a 5 on the title, I read 5 on a Boat by Enid Blyton. For the prompt of reading a book with 5-word title, I read Torso by Michael Bendis. For the prompt of reading the 5th book in a series, I read The Pale Horse by Agatha Christie. For the prompt of reading a book with wood on the cover, I read Ghostspeaker by Charlotte E. English. For the prompt of reading a short story in a book that starts with a page divisible by 5, I read The Adventure of the Dancing Man by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. This was my wrap-up for the second half of March, including the wrap-up of the readathons. Please comment down below, have you read any of these books and what did you think about them? And how did your readathons go? Because there were tons of readathon in the month of March. If you are a new viewer, please like and subscribe. Hope to see you very soon. Bye. As for Turkish Word of the Day, since my favorite book for the second half of March was Giant Spread, I thought giant should be the word of the day. Giant means dev in Turkish, and dev is our Turkish word of